In the small town of Fairview, there was a courthouse that sat at the heart of the community. Judge Henry Whittaker was known for his strict sense of justice and his unwavering commitment to the law. His reputation was built on consistency and a belief that every person should be treated equally under the eyes of the law. No exceptions were made, and no excuses were tolerated. His days followed a predictable rhythm, with each case passing through his courtroom like the turning of pages in a book. But on one fateful morning, everything would change when Clara Miller walked into his court. Clara was not the kind of woman who would normally catch anyone's eye. She was quiet in her movements and steady in her demeanor. She had learned early in life to keep her head down and focus on surviving the cards she had been dealt. Raised by her adoptive parents, Clara had grown up in the town, but never quite felt like she belonged. Her parents were kind people, but there was always something that kept her from truly connecting with them. She felt like an outsider, at times unsure of her place in the world. She carried the weight of her past with her every day, and that morning, it was the burden of a speeding ticket that had brought her to the courthouse. She had been driving to work late when she was caught speeding. The ticket had been issued by a young officer who seemed almost apologetic as he handed it to her, but she knew there was no way out. The fine was hefty, far more than she could afford, but she had no choice but to pay it if she wanted to avoid further legal trouble. Clara wasn't the type to make waves, so when she found herself standing in front of Judge Whittaker, she did her best to explain her situation, hoping for some mercy or understanding. Her voice was steady, but there was a trace of desperation underneath her calm exterior. Judge Whittaker listened intently, but his expression remained unchanged. He had seen hundreds of cases like hers before, people pleading for leniency and offering explanations that could not change the fact of the violation. She had broken the law, and that was all that mattered in that moment. The law was clear, and without exception, the fine would stand, and Clara would have to pay the consequences. He spoke in measured tones, delivering his decision with the authority that came with years of experience in his role. He informed her that the fine would be steep, and there would be no reduction. Clara's heart sank as she heard the judgment. She knew she couldn't afford to pay the fine, and a small knot of panic began to form in her chest. But she didn't argue. She had learned long ago that arguing would get her nowhere. Instead, she nodded quietly and stepped away from the podium with a forced smile. She didn't look up as she walked out of the courtroom, her head down and her mind racing as she made her way toward the door. But as she passed the judge's bench, something unexpected happened. She felt the weight of his gaze upon her, and for just a moment their eyes met. It was fleeting, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. The connection was instant and inexplicable. There was something about the way Judge Whittaker looked at her that felt strangely familiar. It wasn't just the sternness of his gaze or the authority in his posture. It was something deeper, a feeling she couldn't quite place, something that made her pause for a brief moment as she stepped out of the room unseen by anyone else in the room. The briefest flicker of recognition passed between them both, but neither of them would understand the significance of it, not yet. Back in his chambers, Judge Henry Whittaker sat at his desk, staring at a pile of paperwork that seemed to multiply no matter how much he worked. He had always been a methodical man, keeping his emotions at bay and focusing solely on the tasks at hand. But since Clara Miller had walked out of his courtroom, something inside him had shifted. There was a feeling he couldn't shake, a nagging sense of familiarity that clung to him every time he thought of her. Her face was still fresh in his mind. Her wide eyes had held an expression that seemed almost too knowing, too familiar for a woman he had just met in his court. There had been something in the way she looked at him, as if she too had recognized something in him, something neither of them could name, but the connection had been brief and fleeting and so quickly buried under the surface of his professional duties that he hadn't given it much thought at first. But now, in the solitude of his chambers, as he sifted through his work and tried to clear his mind, he found himself constantly thinking of her. Her face, her expression, even the way she held herself, seemed to haunt him. It wasn't just her appearance, it was something more intangible, a feeling that pulled at him in ways he couldn't explain. He had dismissed it as a coincidence or his mind playing tricks on him, but the more he thought about it, the more the unease gnawed at him. What unsettled him the most was the way her gaze had lingered on him. As she left the courtroom, there was a depth to it, a silent understanding that had passed between them, something that couldn't be ignored. It felt as though Clara had recognized him, just as much as he had recognized her. The thought of it unsettled him, but he couldn't dismiss it. He had been a judge for years and had seen countless people come and go from his courtroom, but never had he felt such a strong and immediate connection with anyone like this. Unable to shake the feeling, he did what he had always done. When faced with an uncomfortable thought or question, he turned to research. He began digging into his family history, trying to find anything that could explain why Clara's face seemed so familiar. He started with the basics, a review of his family tree and old photos, but everything seemed normal at first. There were no strange connections or surprises, just the familiar faces of his ancestors and relatives. But the more he dug, the more questions began to arise. Henry knew his mother had died several years ago, but what he didn't know was that before her passing she had been involved in something that would only now come to light. His mother had been part of a closed adoption arrangement, a decision that had remained a secret for many years. Henry's family had never discussed it. He had no idea that his mother had given up a child for adoption, but the more he researched, the more he discovered that Clara's birth mother had been part of the same adoption arrangement and had been forced to give up her child due to circumstances that were beyond her control. Henry's heart raced as he connected the dots. Could Clara Miller be his sister? Could she be the child his mother had placed for adoption all those years ago? Could that be the reason why she had felt so familiar to him? Clara Miller was not just a woman from his courtroom. She was someone from his past, someone tied to him by blood. He couldn't believe it, but the pieces fit together too perfectly to ignore it. The realization hit him like a wave, and for the first time in his life, Henry Whittaker felt the weight of something far greater than the law, something that transcended his role as a judge. He needed to know more. He needed to find Clara and uncover the truth about their connection. It was no longer just about a fleeting glance or a feeling. It was about family and the ties that bound them in ways neither of them had understood until now. The days following Henry's discovery were filled with a sense of urgency and disbelief. He had always prided himself on being in control of every situation, relying on logic and reason to navigate his life. But now, faced with the possibility that Clara Miller, the woman he had fined so harshly in his courtroom, might be his sister, everything he thought he knew about himself and his family was being upended. Unable to push aside the gnawing sense of responsibility, Henry found himself consumed by a single thought. He had to find Clara. He couldn't let the questions hang in the air, couldn't let this opportunity slip away without understanding the truth. The research he had started felt incomplete, the family records too vague, and the fragments of information scattered across different archives seemed to lead nowhere. It was clear that he needed more than just old records. He needed to speak to Clara herself. The first thing he did was contact a private genealogist, someone who specialized in uncovering hidden family connections. Henry had hoped to unravel the mystery through official channels, believing that the genealogist could provide concrete evidence that would either confirm or deny his suspicions. He was reluctant to go straight to Clara without proof, afraid of how she might react to such an unbelievable claim. But he also knew that this wasn't just a normal case anymore. It was personal, and it demanded delicate handling. Weeks passed as Henry awaited the genealogist's report. The waiting game only deepened his anxiety, leaving him restless in the quiet moments when he wasn't buried under his judicial duties. He had to know, had to understand the truth about his mother's secret life, about Clara's origins, and whether or not they were truly connected by blood. But with each passing day, the questions piled up, and he began to doubt whether he was doing the right thing. Then, one evening, the genealogist's report finally arrived. Henry sat at his desk, his hands trembling as he opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the documents quickly, his heart racing in anticipation. The report confirmed something he had hoped for, but feared at the same time. Clara Miller was indeed his sister. The records detailed the adoption of Clara's birth mother, a woman whose name Henry vaguely recognized from his childhood. The adoption had been kept secret, hidden even from Henry himself. His mother, struggling with circumstances beyond her control, had made the heartbreaking decision to give up her child. At the time, Henry had been too young to understand, but now the truth was clear. Clara had been adopted into a different family, and she had spent her life not knowing her biological origins. Clara's story was one of deep loss and separation, but so was Henry's. His own mother had never spoken of the child she had given up, and Henry had grown up never knowing he had a sister. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. He had spent his whole life unaware of the sibling he had lost, the family member who had been living in the same town all along. With this newfound information, Henry knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep this knowledge to himself anymore. It was no longer just a matter of curiosity, it was a matter of family. His sister, Clara, was out there, and he had to find her. But how would she react? What would she think of the man who had fined her so harshly in his courtroom? Henry had no answers, only the growing sense that this discovery would change both of their lives forever. As the days stretched into weeks, Henry began to plan his next move. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had to make the first step. He couldn't undo the years of separation between them, but maybe, just maybe, he could give them both a chance at something more than what they had before. Clara Miller had never imagined that her life would change so drastically after a single encounter in a courthouse. The fine that Judge Henry Whittaker had imposed on her felt like just another struggle in a life filled with challenges. But the strange letter she had received a week later was unlike anything she had expected. The letter was formal and brief, asking her to meet Henry Whittaker in person. The tone was respectful yet distant, and there was no indication as to why he would want to speak with her. Her first instinct was to toss it aside, dismissing it as another case of bureaucracy or someone wanting to talk about the fine. But something in the back of her mind told her to take it seriously. The day of the meeting arrived, and Clara found herself standing outside a small cafe in the heart of the town, feeling more uncertain than she had in a long time. She didn't know why she was there, why this man who had fined her for a simple speeding ticket now wanted to talk. Her life had always been a series of small, practical steps: go to work, care for her children, pay the bills, get by. She wasn't someone who looked for drama or complications. But something about the situation felt different, and she had learned over the years that ignoring an instinct often led to regret. When she entered the cafe, she spotted Henry immediately. He was sitting at a corner table, looking just as out of place as she felt. He stood when he saw her and offered her a tight, polite smile. There was an awkwardness between them, the kind that only comes from a strange and sudden shift in reality. Clara hesitated before sitting down across from him, studying his face. He looked older than she had remembered, his sharp features softened by age and worry. But there was something else in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. "Thank you for meeting with me," Henry began, his voice measured and formal. "I know this might seem strange, but I felt it was necessary." Clara folded her arms across her chest, a reflex that told her she wasn't entirely ready to open up to him. "What's this about? I'm still trying to understand why you would want to speak with me after what happened in court." Henry took a deep breath, his gaze faltering for a moment before he met her eyes again. "I want to explain something to you, something important, and I think you deserve to know." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Clara, I believe we might be family." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Clara blinked in disbelief. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she thought she must have misunderstood. "What do you mean?" she asked slowly, her voice laced with both confusion and skepticism. Henry's hands were shaking slightly, though he did his best to hide it. "I've been researching my family history, and I found something that connects us. Your birth mother, she was connected to my family. There was an adoption arrangement many years ago. Clara, I believe that you and I share the same mother. I think you might be my sister." Clara's mind raced as the words settled in. Her first instinct was to laugh, to dismiss the whole thing as a cruel joke or a mix-up. But Henry's face was earnest, his eyes full of a deep, unsettling sincerity. The disbelief turned into something more tangible: fear, uncertainty, and an overwhelming curiosity. Could it be true? Was this possible? Clara sat back in her chair, her mind scrambling to make sense of the revelation. Her birth mother, whom she had never known, had been tied to the Whittaker family all along. The idea seemed impossible. The weight of the accusation felt too heavy for her to carry in that moment. "I don't understand," she whispered, the words slipping from her mouth before she could stop them. How do you know this? How could you be so sure? Henry leaned forward, his hands clasped together. I've done research. My mother, she had a child before me, a daughter she placed for adoption. I had no idea until recently, but all the signs point to you. Clara, we have the same mother. The adoption papers were hidden for years, but the truth is clear now. Clara was silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. She didn't know what to think or how to feel. Her mind flashed back to her childhood, to the few memories of her adoptive parents' cryptic remarks about her birth mother. There had always been unanswered questions, things left unsaid, and now it seemed like the answers were slowly beginning to surface. She met Henry's gaze once more. "And what do you want from me?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. "What happens now?" Henry's expression softened, and he hesitated before answering. "I want to find out the truth. I want to know who you are, to understand our connection. But more than that, I want to help you, if you let me. We're family, and I didn't know you existed until now, but I think we owe it to ourselves to try." Clara sat back, trying to process everything at once. It was too much to absorb, too much to understand in such a short amount of time. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a random encounter. There was something deeper here, something that tied her to this man in a way she never could have imagined. The days after the cafe meeting were filled with a whirlwind of emotions for Clara. The shock of Henry's revelation lingered in her thoughts, leaving her mind in a constant state of turmoil. She had spent most of her life feeling like something was missing, a sense of identity that had always eluded her, but the possibility of having a brother, a family she never knew existed, was almost too much to grasp. She had always wondered about her birth parents, but she had never expected to find them. Adoption was something her adoptive parents never discussed in detail, and it had always felt like an unspoken part of her story. But now, faced with the startling possibility that she might have a brother, she felt a strange sense of connection that she couldn't ignore. She had no idea what this meant for her future, but she couldn't dismiss the truth that Henry had presented so earnestly. But Clara also felt the weight of doubt pressing down on her. This man, Judge Henry Whittaker, the one who had found her just days ago, claimed to be her brother. Could it really be true? She didn't know him beyond the brief interaction in the courtroom. He was a stranger to her in so many ways, and the idea of a deep family connection seemed almost too surreal to accept. Her mind raced with questions. Why hadn't he reached out sooner? Why hadn't her adoptive parents ever mentioned anything? And what did this mean for her own identity? Could a stranger really become family in an instant? She spent the following days in a daze, trying to balance the swirling emotions with the daily responsibilities of her life. Her job, her children, her bills. Everything continued as usual, but her mind kept drifting back to Henry's words. She had so many questions, but she wasn't sure how to approach them. She hadn't yet told anyone about the meeting, unsure of how to explain it. Her closest friend, Sarah, had noticed her distraction and had asked several times if something was wrong. But Clara only offered vague responses, not yet ready to share the truth. One evening, as Clara sat in her small kitchen, the phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Henry. His voice sounded more familiar than she expected, his tone reassuring yet still hesitant. "Clara, I know this is a lot to take in," he began, "but I want to help you understand all of this. I'm willing to meet with you again, if you'd like. We can take it slow. There's a lot I can explain, but I don't want to pressure you." Clara took a deep breath, weighing her options. She knew she couldn't ignore this any longer. If Henry was truly her brother, she had to understand what had happened, why her mother had given her up for adoption, and what the future might hold. There was no way to undo the past, but perhaps there was a way to make sense of it. "I'm willing to meet," she finally said, her voice steady but uncertain. "But I need time. I need to process this and figure out what it all means. I'm not sure I can just jump into this." "I understand," Henry replied softly. "Take your time. I just wanted to let you know that I'm here when you're ready." The conversation ended, and Clara sat in silence, her thoughts racing. She had agreed to meet him again, but now she was filled with a new kind of uncertainty. What would she say? What would they talk about? And most importantly, what did it mean to suddenly discover that she wasn't alone in the world, that her family, her real family, had been out there all along? Over the next few days, Clara tried to focus on her work and the normalcy of her routine, but the meeting with Henry loomed in her thoughts. The uncertainty gnawed at her, and she found herself oscillating between excitement and fear. What kind of relationship could she have with him? And how would this revelation change everything she had known about herself? The time came for the meeting, and Clara found herself standing outside the same cafe where they had first met. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She was nervous but determined to face whatever truths lay ahead. As she stepped inside, she saw Henry already seated, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. He smiled, a small, welcoming smile that seemed to offer both reassurance and an invitation to something more. Clara walked over and sat down across from him, her hands trembling slightly. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I still don't know if I can fully accept this. It's a lot to take in." Henry nodded, his expression serious but kind. "I understand. This is a big shock, and I don't expect you to have all the answers. But I'm not going anywhere, Clara. We can take this at your pace. No pressure." She took another deep breath and looked into his eyes. For the first time, she didn't see a stranger who had just found her. She saw someone who genuinely wanted to connect, someone who had his own share of pain and confusion. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, something neither of them had planned for, but something that could heal the emptiness they had both lived with for so long. It was uncertain, but it was real. "I'm ready to listen," Clara said, her voice steadying. "Let's talk." As Clara sat down across from Henry, the air between them was thick with unspoken questions and the weight of the truth they were both trying to grasp. Clara had expected their next meeting to be awkward. She had no idea what to say or what she should feel. But as Henry looked at her, his expression was full of understanding, his eyes reflecting the same uncertainty she felt. For the first time in a long while, Clara didn't feel alone in her confusion. "I know this is hard," Henry began, his voice quiet but firm, "and I don't want to rush you. But I think we need to start somewhere. Maybe we can begin by talking about what we know, about what happened with our mother, and what this all means." Clara nodded, feeling the sting of unshed tears threatening to surface. "I don't even know where to begin," she admitted. "I've always wondered who she was, why I was given up for adoption. My adoptive parents never really talked about it much, and I grew up thinking that part of my past didn't matter. But now," she trailed off, her voice faltering as the weight of the situation settled in. "Now it feels like everything matters." Henry leaned in slightly, his expression sincere. "I get that. It's not easy to suddenly have your whole world turned upside down. My mother, she never spoke of you. I didn't know she had placed a child for adoption, but I've learned that she made that decision when she was very young. I don't know all the details, but I know it was a painful decision for her." Clara's mind raced. A painful decision. That was an understatement. She had grown up in a loving home, but there had always been that lingering sense of not belonging. Now to learn that her mother had made the choice to give her up, it was more than Clara could process all at once. "I don't even know her name," Clara whispered, more to herself than to Henry. "I don't know where she is or why she did it. I always thought if I could just find her, if I could just get those answers, everything would make sense." Henry reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently placed it on hers. "I'm sorry. I wish I had answers for you, Clara. I really do. But I promise you this, I'm not going anywhere. I'll help you find the answers. If you want to know more about her, about your history, I'll be there with you." Clara blinked, surprised by the warmth of his touch. It was a simple gesture, but it made something inside her break open. For so long, she had dealt with the emptiness of not knowing who she was, and now, for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in this search. Henry was offering her something she had never expected: support, family, and perhaps a chance to heal. "I never asked for this," Clara said softly, almost to herself, but Henry heard the vulnerability in her voice. "I never asked to find out I had a brother or that my mother was someone I could never know. And I don't even know if I'm ready to dive into all of this." "I understand," Henry replied quietly. I never asked for this either. But the truth is, we are connected in ways neither of us could have ever imagined. And I think if we can learn to trust each other, we can figure this out together. No matter what happens, you're not in this alone." Clara met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger sitting across from a judge who had once fined her. She saw something else, a man who was genuinely trying to understand her, trying to reach her, despite the strange circumstances that had brought them together. It was overwhelming, but it was real. "So," Clara said, her voice steadier now, "what do we do now? How do we start figuring all of this out?" Henry leaned back slightly in his chair, taking a deep breath. "We start by talking. We start by being honest about what we want and what we're willing to do to get those answers. I can help you trace your birth mother's history. I've already started looking into some records, but I need to go deeper. There are things in my family's past that might shed some light on what happened." Clara nodded, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. "And you think this will give me the answers I need? About my mother, about why she gave me up?" Henry's eyes softened, and he gave a small, encouraging smile. "I hope so, but even if it doesn't, I want you to know that you're not defined by your past. Whatever you find out, we'll figure it out together." Clara exhaled a shaky breath, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't expected. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. With Henry by her side, she felt like there might be a way forward. "I don't know what the future holds," Clara said, her voice quiet but resolute, "but I'm willing to find out. I'll take this one step at a time, Henry. One step at a time." Henry smiled, a true, warm smile this time. "That's all we can do. One step at a time." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity and discovery, with Henry and Clara navigating their newfound connection in ways neither had anticipated. It wasn't easy, but slowly they began to uncover pieces of the past, each fragment of information leading them closer to the truth. Clara found herself at a crossroads, torn between the growing bond she felt with Henry and the overwhelming weight of the history they were digging into. Henry had started by looking into adoption records and contacting old acquaintances from his family's past, including a few distant relatives who might have known something about the circumstances surrounding Clara's adoption. He spent countless hours poring over documents, interviewing people who might have been involved, and going through archives that he never imagined would hold such significance. But despite his best efforts, the pieces didn't seem to fit together as easily as he had hoped. The more he uncovered, the more questions arose. Clara's birth mother had left behind little evidence of her life, and the adoption itself had been shrouded in secrecy. It was as if the past had been buried on purpose. Clara, on the other hand, was struggling with the emotional weight of everything. She had never thought much about the identity of her birth mother, accepting the life she had been given with her adoptive parents. But now, as she learned more about the woman who had given her up, the questions were gnawing in her. What kind of person had she been? Why had she made the choice to give Clara up, and where had she gone? Was there some deeper reason behind her decision, or was it a simple act of circumstance? Clara found herself imagining who this woman might have been. Someone just like her, someone who had once walked down the same path, but then veered away, leaving her child behind. As much as Clara wanted answers, she also felt a profound sense of loss. Her adoptive parents had been kind and loving, and they had raised her as their own. But with each passing day, the gap between her old life and the new reality she was uncovering seemed to widen. The simple life she had once known felt increasingly distant, like it belonged to someone else. One evening, after a long day of sifting through old family records, Henry called Clara with a breakthrough. "I think I've found something," Henry said, his voice full of excitement. "It's not much, but it's a start." Clara's heart quickened. "What did you find?" "I contacted a few people who might have known your mother. There's a woman, Sarah Whitmore, who used to work with her. She was close to your mother in the years before the adoption happened. She might know more about what happened, about why your mother made the decision." Clara felt a strange sense of relief at the news. After weeks of dead ends and uncertainty, it seemed like they were finally getting somewhere. "Do you think she'll talk to me?" Clara asked, her voice hesitant. "I'll call her first," Henry replied, "but I think she will. She knew your mother well, and from what I've gathered, she's someone who believes in the importance of family. She might be willing to share what she knows." Clara felt a flicker of hope. The idea of meeting someone who had known her mother, someone who could offer a glimpse into the life of the woman who had once been a part of her, was both thrilling and terrifying. She hadn't expected to feel this way, but the desire for answers had become an insatiable hunger, one she couldn't ignore any longer. The next week, Henry arranged a meeting with Sarah Whitmore. Clara's nerves were frayed as the day approached. She had spent so many years wondering about the woman who had given her life, and now, after all this time, she was about to meet someone who could fill in the gaps of her past. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the emotions it might stir up, but she knew she had to face it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to understand the truth behind her adoption, to uncover the secrets that had been hidden from her for so long. When Clara and Henry arrived at the small coffee shop where they were meeting Sarah, Clara felt her stomach tighten. She had spent hours imagining what this moment would feel like, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. Sarah Whitmore was a woman in her early 60s, her face kind but weathered with time. She had a gentle demeanor, but Clara could tell that she carried a quiet strength. After the initial pleasantries, Sarah got straight to the point. "I knew your mother," she said softly, her voice filled with both sadness and a deep respect. "Her name was Margaret, and she was a young woman when she had you. We were close friends, but the circumstances of your adoption were complicated. I've never forgotten her, Clara. I've always wondered what happened to you." Clara felt her heart race as Sarah spoke. Margaret. Her mother's name was Margaret. It was the first real piece of the puzzle, and Clara felt a wave of emotion rush over her. She had a name. Her mother had a name. It was a beginning, a thread to follow into the past. "I don't know everything," Sarah continued, her voice tinged with regret, "but I can tell you that your mother loved you. She made the hardest decision of her life when she gave you up, and she carried that pain with her for years." Clara sat quietly, taking in Sarah's words. It was overwhelming, but it was the first time she felt like the pieces of her life were starting to fall into place. Margaret had loved her. She hadn't been abandoned or forgotten. She had been a mother, forced to make a choice that neither she nor Clara would ever fully understand. With each word Sarah spoke, Clara began to feel a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed, but there was still so much more to learn, so much more to uncover about her mother and about the life that could have been. And with Henry by her side, she felt ready to continue her journey, no matter where it led. As the weeks went by, Clara found herself in a constant state of reflection, piecing together the fragments of her past. Each conversation with Henry and Sarah had peeled back another layer of mystery, revealing bits of the woman her birth mother had been, and the reasons behind the decision to place Clara for adoption. It wasn't easy for Clara to reconcile these new pieces with the life she had built, but she was beginning to understand, piece by piece, the complexities of family, love, and sacrifice. Clara's emotions had been all over the place. Some days she felt overwhelmed by the love her adoptive parents had shown her and the bond they had shared. Other days, she couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that came with the knowledge that she had never truly known her birth mother. But one thing had become clearer than ever. The relationship she had with Henry was growing stronger. Despite the shock of their initial meeting, Clara had started to see Henry not just as the judge who had fined her, but as the brother he had claimed to be, a real brother, one who was there for her when she needed him most. Their conversations had become more frequent, their connection more natural. They spent hours talking about their shared family history, about their hopes for the future, and about the challenges they had both faced in their lives. It felt strange at first, this bond that had blossomed out of something unexpected, but Clara began to realize that Henry was the family she had always needed, even if she hadn't known it. One day, Henry invited Clara over to his house for dinner, an informal gathering where they could talk more about their growing connection. Clara had hesitated at first, uncertain about what to expect, but something inside her told her that it was time to take another step forward. She needed to see for herself what this new chapter of her life would look like, and this was as good a place to start as any. So when Clara arrived at Henry's home, she was greeted with warmth. The house was cozy, with family photos adorning the walls and a peaceful atmosphere that made her feel at ease. Henry had prepared dinner himself, a simple but delicious meal, and as they sat down at the table, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. As they ate, Henry shared more about his childhood, about his own experiences growing up in the Whittaker family. He told Clara about the struggles he had faced as a young man, how he had worked his way through law school, and how he had eventually become a judge. Clara listened intently, amazed by the man sitting across from her, and by how much they had in common, despite the years of separation. "I always wanted a sibling," Henry said, his voice thoughtful. "I never thought I'd find one like you, but now that I have, I can't imagine my life without you in it." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She had never expected to hear those words, but they meant more to her than she could put into words. In a way, they validated everything she had been feeling: the confusion, the uncertainty, and the sense of loss. She had always wondered about the family she had never known, and now, in a small, quiet moment over dinner, she was beginning to see that family had always been closer than she thought. "I never imagined this either," Clara replied, her voice soft but sincere. "I've been through so much, and I've always wondered about my past. But now, I don't feel so lost anymore. I feel like I'm finally starting to understand who I am." Henry smiled, a warm and genuine expression. "You're not alone in this, Clara. You never have been. I've got your back, and I always will." The words hung in the air between them, a promise, an assurance that no matter where life took them, they would face it together. Clara's heart swelled with emotion. It wasn't the family she had once imagined, but it was real, and it was hers. As they finished dinner, Henry shared his plans to continue researching Margaret's past, to try and uncover more of the story behind Clara's adoption. But Clara wasn't sure if she needed that anymore. The questions about her mother remained, of course, but the discovery of her brother and the bond they had begun to form had given her something far more important: a sense of belonging, a feeling that no matter how complicated or painful her past had been, she was finally finding her place in the world. The evening came to a close, and as Clara stood up to leave, Henry walked her to the door. "You're welcome here any time," he said with a smile. "We've got a lot of catching up to do." Clara nodded, feeling a warmth in her chest. "I think we've already made a good start." As she drove home that night, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The path she had been walking on had been long and uncertain, but now, with Henry by her side, it felt like she was finally on the right track. No longer a stranger to her own story, Clara had found her family, and in doing so, she had found herself. The journey wasn't over. It never truly was. But Clara knew that no matter what came next, she wouldn't face it alone. And that, for the first time in her life, was enough.